On October 23rd, the Trump administration announced to Congress that it is planning land attacks within Venezuelan territory. Such attacks, of course, would be acts of war, and there are no plans for Congress to declare war on any foreign state. Moreover, on Tuesday, Trump declared that any country deemed by the administration to be making drugs for U.S. markets is eligible for a U.S. military attack. Trump also stated that military strikes on Venezuelan territory would, quote, start very soon, unquote. Meanwhile, the administration has been using the U.S. military to engage in extrajudicial killings of persons in the Caribbean alleged to be so-called narco terrorists. The administration admits it doesn't actually know who these people are that are being targeted by the U.S. military. The U.S. military is simply killing people without any evidence of actual crime or of a military threat. Nor has the administration attempted to offer any evidence. The justification for the killings is simply, trust me. The attacks are also meant to serve as a provocation and a threat to the Venezuelan regime, and to serve as an example of what will be done on Venezuelan territory if the current Venezuelan president does not go into exile. So much for the U.S. president, who, while a candidate, claimed he would oppose any new wars and end existing ones. Instead, what we have now is a president who advocates for a new war in South America, in addition to his proxy wars in Palestine and Ukraine, and apparently has no intention of adhering to any sort of rule of law in doing so. So this is yet another case of here we go again. Every few years, no matter who is president, the U.S. regime, specifically the foreign policy blob in Washington, comes up with yet another country that we're told requires, quote unquote, regime change. And as with all drives to war, the result is more runaway federal spending, more disregard for the rule of law, and more unmitigated power for the American executive state. By now, it's very quaint to protest the American warfare state by suggesting that presidents should adhere to the U.S. Constitution. No president has taken the U.S. Constitution seriously in decades, and Congress has done precious little about it. Nonetheless, whatever opposition can be mustered to the untrammeled bellicosity of U.S. presidents is a good thing. This week, for example, a handful of members of Congress introduced legislation prohibiting Trump from launching hostilities within or against Venezuela without congressional approval. There's a bipartisan group, and only a small handful of Republicans have spoken out against the president on the administration's accelerating threats and on the killings of alleged narco-terrorists in boats outside U.S. territory. Unsurprisingly, Thomas Massie of Kentucky supports the war powers legislation, for example, which attempts to somewhat limit the president to his actual constitutional authority. Senator Rand Paul, meanwhile, has condemned the killings of passengers and operators of these so-called drug boats, and rightly so. As Judge Andrew Napolitano noted this week, one of the most recent drug boat, quote-unquote, attacks clearly violated international law when the U.S. disabled one boat and then, rather than arrest the survivors, simply killed them. Napolitano correctly describes this as a war crime. Of course, even if Congress does pass legislation reining in the president's power to commit acts of war against Venezuela, it's unclear the legislation would have any effect. The U.S. regime is far beyond accepting legal limits on war-making that might have been otherwise imposed by the U.S. Constitution, a document that is obviously defunct and really simply does not guide U.S. foreign policy in any way, except in maybe the minds of those clinging to a romantic fantasy about the state of modern American politics. Now, it's a given that the rule of law will be ignored in this conflict, just as it has been ignored for many decades. But an important political question is this: does the Venezuelan regime pose any threat to actual Americans? With questions like these, the burden of proof is always on those who want a new war and are demanding tax dollars to do it. So, where is the evidence of a Venezuelan threat? If there were one posed by the actual regime down there, we'd be sure to hear about it, since it would greatly help the warmonger's case. But it seems the best the administration can do is deem without evidence the Venezuelan regime as a terrorist organization targeting the U.S., since that provides a way of avoiding an actual declaration of war. But here they don't even make the case for any real terrorism, such as the bombing of buildings. No, the administration has been clinging to the idea that Venezuela is sponsoring narco-terrorism with that adjective modifier attached. And this term is extremely flexible and could include anything from cartel activity to the mere selling of drugs within the United States. And all of this is a very long way from weapons of mass destruction or dirty bombs or even anthrax in your mail, which is the sort of thing the regime used to put forward as terrorism. Now we're left with this new kind of terrorism that requires a U.S. bombing campaign against Venezuela, the terrorism apparently being selling drugs in the United States. So in the end, of course, narco-terrorism, that angle is simply political cover for helping carry out the longtime plans of neoconservatives who have dreamed for many years of installing a U.S. puppet in Venezuela. The fact that Trump recently pardoned Honduran drug lord Juan Orlando Hernandez, though, who served only 1 year of a 45-year sentence in federal prison, illustrates that the administration is not really all that concerned about drug trafficking. Trump's neoconservative bona fides, though, are now firmly in place. This is a president who vehemently supports Senator Lindsey Graham, for example, one of the most committed warmongering neocons in Congress. And the administration also has resurrected the career of Elliott Abrams, who directed a wide variety of U.S. interventions in Latin America back in the 80s. And he was appointed during the first Trump term as a special representative for both Iran and Venezuela. Abrams, a diehard Zionist, of course, has been working for many years for regime change in Venezuela, and Trump may be the one to finally get it for him. Abrams' most recent column at Foreign Affairs pushing for more regime change shows that he isn't giving up. Now, it's always difficult to guess any politician's true intentions, and this is certainly true of Trump. Regime change, in any case, remains one of the worst options going forward. After all, what success has the U.S. had with regime change in recent decades? The U.S. spent 20 years replacing the Taliban with the Taliban in Afghanistan. After years of allying with terrorists in Syria to remove the Assad regime there, Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists are now the new dictators of Syria, and Trump has these terrorists over to visit the White House. In Iraq, that country's ancient Christian community was decimated by U.S. intervention there. The standard of living there utterly collapsed, and the Iraqi regime, contrary to U.S. interests, you would think, is now far more friendly toward Iran than it was under Saddam Hussein. I mean, it's amazing how much policy in the Middle East has been justified on containing Iran just to turn around and turn Iraq into more of an Iran ally. And then, of course, there's Libya, which is now a hotbed for terrorism with slave markets and has a totally ruined economy. These are apparently the American regime's success stories for regime change. Now, what horrors await the people of Venezuela if the U.S. carries out regime change there? I hope we do not find out, but one likely outcome is this: an enormous wave of Venezuelan refugees moving north. Nonetheless, perennial calls for regime change somewhere are now standard operating procedure in Washington, with or without Trump in the White House. Every minute of every day, the American empire is dreaming up new wars and new excuses for new wars. Trump apparently has no problem with playing along so long as it helps him spend more money on his key constituents, especially his pro-Israel funders and the corporate welfare queens at organizations like Raytheon. Now, some MAGA supporters have expressed disappointment in the administration's refusal to do much to change course on this. But as Tom Mullen recently noted, he says, quote, "Part of the problem is that Trump's anti-war platform was never as radical as the true America First crowd would have us believe. He talks a good game about ending forever wars, but he doesn't question the core of the empire, the global standing army, the 800-plus bases warehousing hundreds of thousands of troops overseas, and the non-defensive use of them, as long as the war isn't a quote-unquote forever war," unquote. Indeed, Trump's posture reminds one of Madeleine Albright's famous complaint to Colin Powell during the Clinton years, when she said, "What's the point of having this superb military that you're always talking about if we can't use it?" unquote. Well, an empire with a huge offensive military is likely to use it, and Donald Trump clearly likes this idea.